Hi, I am Jude. Welcome to my Java programming course. In this lesson, we are going to learn about static and final keywords in Java. This video is part of a complete Java course I have published on YouTube. If you are interested in becoming a Java expert, I would highly encourage you to check out the rest of the videos as well. If you followed this course from the beginning, I'm pretty sure you are confident when it comes to creating an object in Java programming language. Here what we have done was simply creating an object and assign that into a reference called C1. After that, we use the reference and access the variable called color and change the value inside that variable to red string value. You know, using the reference followed by the dot sign, we are allowed to access variables and methods inside that object. But of course, you know about access modifiers and how it can impact. Now let's imagine you are going to create another object out of the same class. Now you have created a totally different new object which has no relation to the previous object. And you also created a new reference and call it as C2. So the idea here is any object that you create out of a class, the variables and methods are attached to that object. So making a modification to a one object will not have any impact to the rest of the objects of the same class. I also want to make all my students understand these few English words or terms. Member variables, instance variables, object attributes, member fields. All these four things refer to the same thing. What it means actually, any variables that you define or write inside a class body and that can be accessed only using an object reference. In the previous example, the wheels and the color, these two member variables are always attached to the object that you create. We also have a special English word called initialization. Initialization refers to the process of building or creating an object that is managed by the Java. But that process of building the object, we have a special word called initialization. So we are initializing an object out of a class. So that whole process starts with the new keyword and referring to a constructor of that class. Static keyword is a very special reserved keyword in Java. You can use this keyword to decorate variables, methods, blocks, or inner classes in Java. When you use this static keyword, those constructs will not be attached to any of the individual objects you created out of that particular class. For example, in this slide I have shown you, I used a single class file to generate 4 different car objects. On the other hand, in this class file, I have a variable that has been decorated with the static keyword. That variable will not be attached to any of the objects that I have created out of that class. In fact, you don't need a single object to access variables or methods that are marked with the static keyword. How do we access static variables and methods? You don't need to create an object. You just simply have to call by the class name followed by the static property or the method you want to call upon. Whenever you mark a variable or method as static, you cannot access or refer instance or member variables or methods of that same class. But the opposite is always true, because when you have an object, from the object itself, you will always see or you can always access the static content in that class, because they are more like global or common properties and variables that are not bound to any of the objects that we have created out of that same class. Here I have 2 variables and a single method. Out of those 2 variables, I decided to mark the first variable, which is basic price, as a static variable. That means that variable value and the variable itself will not be bounded to any of the instances that I have created from that class. It is more like a common variable across all the instances that you can create out of that class. On the other hand, the taxes and the show price method is regular instance variable and method. Therefore, every individual object that we created out of that car class have its own copy. Pay attention to the show price method implementation. As you can see inside the method body, I have referred a static variable and also an instance variable in this case to calculate the final price. If you remember, in our third lesson, we discussed about variables and how variables should accommodate the changeable behavior of the data. However, sometimes we do have some data values that are not going to change. We can decorate variables as final to denote that the value will not going to be changed. And it is basically restricting any other person later during the program modifying the value. Let's do a simple example to understand these two keywords and how to use them when you are programming. Let's imagine we have a coffee shop, and in this case, we have two customers going to the coffee shop. You know, my dear students, inside a coffee shop, usually we will have the free Wi-Fi. So in order to connect to the Wi-Fi, we should use the particular Wi-Fi password. In this scenario, we can identify two different entities. In this case, we can say coffee shop is an entity and customer is another entity. So for this scenario, we will create these two classes and also experiment with static keyword and final keyword. Let's create a new IntelliJ project called static example. I'm going to remove the auto-generated content inside the main.java file. Let's create a new package called shop under our src folder. Inside the shop package, I'm going to create my new class. The first one is the coffee shop class. Inside this class, I'm going to create a variable to store the Wi-Fi password. Let's also create a new method to show the Wi-Fi password. Let's also create the customer class inside the same shop package we created. Inside the customer class, I'll create a variable to store the name of that particular customer. Since every person will not have the same name, I cannot assign a value. So I'll leave it as null or the default value for this string variable. Let's create a method called connect to Wi-Fi from the customer class. In order to connect to the Wi-Fi network, we need to obtain the Wi-Fi password. If you look into the coffee shop class we wrote, we have a dedicated method called show Wi-Fi password, which will show the Wi-Fi password to any customer. In this case, let's try to call this method from our customer class. Here you can see what we have done was we created an object, and using that reference C of that coffee shop object, we were able to call this show Wi-Fi password method. We don't need to create a coffee shop object every time we need to retrieve or access the password of the Wi-Fi network. We can simply make this method as static method so that every customer can simply call this method without creating an object. So let's mark this method as static method in coffee shop class. Since we mark this method as static method, we don't need to create an object anymore because static variables and methods do not bound to any object. So IntelliJ IDEA already shows us a warning that this is a redundant work. You can simply call using the class name followed by the method we want to access. In this case, this is a static method. Therefore, we can simply call coffeeshop.show Wi-Fi password. We don't need to create an object out of that class. So let's remove this line. Let's create the main method inside the customer class. I'm going to create two customer objects representing the two people inside the coffee shop, the scenario we discussed. Let's connect them individually to the Wi-Fi network. Let's run the main method and observe the output. You can see we have a compilation error. We are getting the error saying we are trying to access a non-static variable inside a static context. That means let's switch back to the coffee shop class where we have the only static method we created. In this case, we are trying to access the Wi-Fi password variable. That is not a static variable. You can see we did not decorate it as static. I told you when we are working with static methods and variables or even blocks, static content cannot refer the regular or instance variables and methods. In this case, the Wi-Fi password is at the moment is an instance variable. To fix the problem, we can either remove this reference from the static method, or else we can simply make this Wi-Fi password variable also as a static variable. Let's go ahead and mark this variable as static variable. Now you can see the error has disappeared. Let's switch back to our customer class and run the main method again. You can see program has successfully executed, but the problem is the customer names are null. In fact, we actually did not set the customer names. In the C1 and C2 objects, I did not assign the value for the name. In fact, that means it has been assigned the default value inside the customer class. For that variable, the string name, the Java assigned the default value of null. Let's fix that after we creating the customer objects. We can either create something like this. Now let's run the program and observe the output. You can see the name has been properly assigned to the particular object. In this case, these two objects, C1 and C2, have the proper names assigned to those variables. However, this is not very intuitive. In fact, if we have something like this, where when we are creating the object itself, if we could have provide the name, we don't need to modify the variables after we create the objects. So if we have something like this, we don't need to have these two lines after that. But however, we do not have a custom constructor which accepts a string variable type. So if you hover over it and press Alt Enter, the IntelliJ will already suggesting to create a custom constructor in that class. You can press Enter, selecting the Create Constructor option. And here you can provide the variable name or the parameter as the name. Inside the constructor body, let's assign the value to our name variable. Now let's run the program again and observe the output. Here you can see the value has not been assigned like the initial case. Here you can see when I create the customer objects, I pass the necessary values, the name for that customer object. However, inside the constructor, that has not been assigned to that variable properly. The problem is this variable is not actually this name variable. Inside the construct implementation, I did not properly refer the variable name inside that current object. So in order to do that, I must use this keyword alongside that variable that I want to assign the value into. In this case, you can see the value whatever I received through the constructor, I assign that to the this dot name. In this case, what I mean is the object that is being constructing this variable name in that object has to assign that particular value. So let's rerun the program and observe the output. This should have the proper values as we are expecting. You can see the names are properly set to the two customer objects. Now, since the Wi-Fi password is a static variable, we can access it without creating an object. You can see we can even assign values outside that class. Let's say someone has hacked the password. If the first customer wants to connect to the Wi-Fi again, you will see the password has been changed. We did not change any attributes inside these two objects we created out of the customer class. However, in this line number 22, we hacked the password of the Wi-Fi network. So this is not encouraged. Like, we should not allow any outsider to go and change the Wi-Fi password in the coffee shop. In this case, we can utilize the final keyword that we learned in this lesson. When we mark this variable as final, we are saying we do not want to change this value here after this line. So if we switch back to our customer class, you can see there is a compilation error because this static variable in fact is a final variable. And if you hover over this error, you will see you cannot assign a value to a final variable of this Wi-Fi password variable. So we have to remove these two lines because it will not compile. Now let's address the big elephant in the room. Since the day you started learning Java programming language, if you remember, you had to write this particular main method without knowing everything what it means. If you look into this main method, it has been actually decorated with the static keyword. That means you don't have to create an object to call this method. In fact, main method is a very special method and we don't have to create object out of the customer class to run the main method. We can simply right click and run. You can see from the run option also they mention as customer.main method. That means this is a static method. That's why we don't have to create any object in order to start our Java application. I also want to highlight you've been using another static variable since the beginning of this course. If you scroll up, and check the connect to Wi-Fi method, inside the connect to Wi-Fi method implementation, I always use this particular method call to print something to the terminal or the console. In this case, you can see we are actually using a variable inside the system class. In fact, that is a static variable. That's why we did not have to create an object out of the system class. For example, we did not write every time something like this and then call upon the out variable, because we do not have to do that, since that out variable inside the system class is a static variable. If we navigate to this out variable by pressing the control and click on this out variable name, we will navigate to that particular variable definition. You can see this variable has been decorated with the public access modifier, and then we also used a static keyword. Then we have the final keyword, and after that we have the data type and the variable name equal sign the value that initially assigned to this. Let me remove this content because I want to show you how to generate a datetime object. In this case, what you need to access is local datetime class. This class is included inside the JDK itself, so you don't have to worry about adding extra libraries and anything like that. You can simply write local datetime.now. If you are on Windows, you can press Control and click on this method. If you are on macOS, you can press Command and click on this method. It will navigate to that particular exact method inside the Java development kit. You can see this method has been decorated with the static keyword, and that's why we were able to access it without creating an object of local datetime class. We also have static variables in many places across the JDK. For example, the math class has the pi value as a static variable. You can press Control and click on this variable. You can see this is a variable. It has a value, and this has been decorated with the static keyword as well as the final keyword, because pi is a universal value across our entire universe. So you cannot change, or we should not allow any programmer or user of this variable to change the value of that particular constant. Before I finish this lesson, I want to teach you about immutable objects. When you create an immutable object, you cannot modify it later. To understand clearly what is an immutable object, let's imagine you have an Apple iPhone 5s. It's a bit older model. Now you decide you need to have a better camera, or you want to increase the storage capacity. Can you really modify your old iPhone 5s? This probably not, because they have built it in a way that you cannot modify it by yourself. If you want to upgrade or you want to have a better camera, the option is you actually have to buy a new iPhone. You have to throw away your old iPhone, but you have to buy a completely new iPhone in order to have the modified attributes and behaviors. So this is clearly the concept of immutable objects. Let's create a new Java package under our src folder called mobile. Inside this mobile package, I'm going to create a new class called iPhone. So my intention is any object that is created out of this iPhone class will be an immutable object. Let me introduce two variables, the iPhone model name and the storage capacity. We can introduce a new custom constructor that accepts the values that needs to be assigned to these two variables. So at the time someone wants to create an iPhone object, they have to provide the model name and storage. If we leave this class as follows, inside the same package, the model name and the storage variable will be allowed to modify because we did not utilize the access modifiers. Let's make these two variables as private so that no one else outside of this class will be able to access these two variables. Since we do not want any outsiders to modify the values of these two variables, we can utilize the final keyword. Now let's switch back to our main class and the main method that has been generated for us. Let's create an iPhone object. Since we wrote a custom constructor, there will be no default constructor provided by the Java. So we must now utilize the custom constructor. The iPhone object that we just created does not even allow us to see the model name or the storage that we just provided. So we have to provide some getter methods or the accessor methods to see what are available inside that immutable object. However, we are not going to allow any modifications. Let's switch back to the iPhone class and let's provide getter methods. Basically, a getter method is simply returning the value that is already available, but you cannot assign back any other new value to that variable. In this case, what we need to write is a method that only expose or return the variable value to the outside caller. This new method that we introduce inside this iPhone class, getModelName, what it does is simply returning the value of the model name private variable. We will mark this method as public so that anyone can call this method without any access modifier restrictions. Let's create a similar method for the storage variable as well. Now you can see these two methods are doing the same work. Basically, they are intended for the particular variable name and to only allow or expose the value to the outside world from this iPhone class. But this method do not allow you to modify the value of the variable of model name. So we call these kind of methods as getter methods because they have the prefix of this method as get. In fact, these getter methods are well-known kind of methods because they do not have any logic inside those methods, simply returning the value inside that object. We can actually generate the getter methods from the IDE itself. We can remove this. Let me show you how to generate the getter methods. You can press Command and N keys together or else Control and N keys in macOS. You will get this particular pop-up, and with the arrow keys, you can select the second option, which is the getter, which is what I was explaining to you. You can press Enter. In this pop-up, you can actually select both of these attributes and then click OK. Now you can see the IDE itself generated these getter methods for you. Now let's switch back to our main Java file. Now inside the iPhone object, we have the getters. In this case, we have the getStorage and getModelName methods to access the variable values. However, we cannot modify the object values because that is the nature of the immutable object, and that is how we have structured the iPhone class to make all the objects as immutable when we create an object. Alright, my dear students, since we came to the end of this video, I want to summarize about what we have learned together. We started off this video by reviewing our understanding about Java objects. We also discussed about the static keyword. Then we also understood that the static variables and methods can only refer other static variables inside the Java classes. We also talked about the immutable objects. Immutable objects are regular objects, but they do not allow any modification to their internal state of the object. With this knowledge, I believe you are in a very good position to understand about arrays and collections. Therefore, I invite you to join with me. My next video, we are going to learn about arrays and collections in Java.